The Duke of Alistair married a woman he expected to die. It was a transaction, tidy and grim, a settling of accounts between his ancient solvent line and her father's, which had crashed into ruin like a ship against unseen rocks. The debt was a chasm, the daughter was the bridge. Her name was Ilara, and she was a whisper of a thing, all sharp angles and translucent skin, with a cough that rattled in her chest like dry leaves skittering over pavement. The physicians had given her a year, perhaps 2 if she were kept quiet. The Duke, a man who valued quiet efficiency above all else, found the arrangement suitable. He would acquire a title his father had coveted, settle a debt that had been a stone in the shoe of his family for a generation, and be left a widower in a respectable amount of time. He would be free. They travelled north for 2 days to the estate designated as her dower house. Blackwood Manor was not a home. It was a place of elegant exile, a stone sarcophagus set amongst weeping beeches and skeletal oaks. The air inside tasted of damp stone and the slow, sweet rot of forgotten things. Rain had worked its way through the lead flashing of the roof, leaving leprous stains on the silk wallpaper in the main hall. Great maps of neglect that charted the geography of decay. Furniture stood in the centre of rooms, shrouded in dust-heavy linen, resembling a congregation of ghosts waiting for a sermon that would never come. The house did not welcome her. It absorbed her into its own profound stillness, its own patient surrender to the inevitable. It was a place where one came to an end. The Duke, whose name was Julian, moved through the cold rooms with a brisk, indifferent stride. His mind was elsewhere, on ledgers and letters and the machinations of Parliament. This small northern corner of his world was a loose thread to be tied off. He looked at Ilara, standing pale and silent in the decaying grandeur of the drawing-room, and felt a flicker of something akin to pity. But it was a thin, intellectual emotion, quickly extinguished by the cold fire of pragmatism. He had done his duty. Her fate was now her own. He left her there, with a skeleton staff headed by a steward whose deference was as thin as new ice over deep water, and a housekeeper whose face was a mask of grim resignation. His parting words were not unkind, but they were forged in the Arctic of his own emotional landscape. "The air is restorative in the country," he said, his gaze sliding past her to the rain-streaked window. "I trust you will find peace here." It was a benediction and a dismissal, a polite way of saying, "Die quietly." And then he was gone. The sound of his carriage wheels crunching on the wet gravel was the sound of a key turning in the lock of her tomb. The first winter was a descent. The illness, which had been a quiet companion, became a ravenous beast. It fed on the damp air, on the draughts that slithered under doors and through ill-fitting window frames, on the profound, echoing loneliness of the house. Ilara lived in a single room, the one with the most reliable fireplace, but the chill was in the bones of the place. It was a living cold, a presence that seeped from the stone and settled deep in her lungs. The steward, a man named Finch, delivered her allowance with a sneer veiled in civility, the coins barely enough to cover firewood and the thinnest of broths. The other servants, taking their cue from him, became ghosts, their presence felt only in the brief clatter of a tray left outside her door. She spent her days in a fug of fever and memory, the great canopied bed her entire world. The damask curtains, faded to the colour of old blood, were drawn against a perpetually grey sky. She coughed until her ribs ached with a deep internal bruising, and her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. She was a flickering candle in a great draughty hall, and the wax was melting away. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. She was forgotten, a line item in a ducal ledger already crossed through. She thought of her father, of his desperate final gamble, and felt a bitterness that was sharper than any grief. She was not a daughter. She was collateral. Section. There came a night when the fever peaked. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of shadow and light, of whispered voices from her past, and the relentless, hammering beat of her own heart. She drifted in a black, tideless sea, and felt a profound, seductive pull toward the depths. It would be so easy to let go, so easy to stop fighting, to simply cease. The house seemed to hold its breath around her, waiting. The ancient timbers groaned, the wind moaned in the eaves. It was a lullaby of decay, coaxing her toward the final silence. But as the false dawn painted the grime on the window panes a bruised shade of violet, the fever broke. It receded like a tide, leaving her beached on the shores of consciousness, weak and trembling, but lucid. The sweat on her skin was cold. The sheets were damp and twisted. For the first time in months, her mind was clear, sharp, with a terrifying crystalline clarity. She looked around the room. She saw the peeling wallpaper, a pattern of once gentle roses now choked with mildew. She saw the silverfish that skittered in the shadows. She saw the thick layer of dust on every surface, a fine grey snow that had settled over her life. She saw the water stain on the ceiling, shaped like a grasping hand. This was her grave. They had buried her alive. Section. A feeling began to coalesce in the hollow space inside her, something that was not hope, but its harder, more resilient cousin. It was resolve, cold and sharp as a shard of broken glass. It was a fury so pure and quiet, it felt like stillness. She would not die here. She would not grant them the convenience. Slowly, her muscles screaming in protest, she pushed herself up. She swung her legs, thin and white as birch saplings, over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cold, gritty floorboards. "Mrs. Gable," she called, her voice a dry rasp, a stranger's voice. She called again, louder, infusing the sound with this new, terrible strength. "Get me out of this bed." The housekeeper, a stout woman named Martha Gable, whose face was etched with the grim lines of a long, hard life, appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of shock and weary pity. She had been expecting to find a corpse. Instead, she found a queen, however frail, ascending a throne of ruin. And for the first time in a very long time, Mrs. Gable saw not a dying girl, but the Duchess of Blackwood Manor. Ilara's father had been a gambler and a dreamer, a man who had squandered a fortune on failed ventures and impossible schemes. But he had loved his daughter, and in one of his few moments of foresight, he had given her the only dowry he had left: an education. While other girls of her station were learning watercolour and needlepoint, Ilara was learning double-entry bookkeeping, crop rotation, and the brutal, elegant logic of contracts. "A woman with a sharp mind," he'd told her, "is a fortress no man can conquer." He had been wrong about so many things, but he had been right about that. Her first act as the true mistress of Blackwood was to summon Mr. Finch to the small, cold morning room she had claimed as her own. He arrived with his customary smirk, the ledger tucked under his arm like a prop. He expected a few weak complaints, a plea for more funds, which he would patiently deny. He found Ilara seated behind a scrubbed pine table, a shawl around her shoulders, her face pale, but her eyes burning with an unnerving intensity. "The full estate accounts, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice quiet but inflexible. "For the last 5 years." He blustered, he demurred, he spoke of the Duke's instructions, of the complexity of the ducal finances. She simply waited, her gaze never leaving his face. She let the silence stretch, let it become a weapon. Finally, sweating, he retrieved them. For a week, she did nothing but study the ledgers. The numbers told a story of methodical theft. Inflated prices for suppliers who didn't exist. Wages for stable hands at a stable that had been empty for a decade. Rents from tenant farmers that were never recorded. It was a tapestry of greed, woven with breathtaking audacity. When she summoned Finch again, she did not accuse him. She simply opened the ledger to a specific page. "I find myself puzzled by the quarterly order of £300 of seed grain for the North Field," she said, her voice conversational. "As the North Field has been fallow since the late Duke's passing, and is, by my estimation, more stone than soil, I cannot imagine what you intended to grow there. Perhaps," she added, her eyes lifting to meet his, "you were cultivating a personal fortune?" The man's face went the colour of spoiled milk. She gave him a choice: a quiet departure with a single month's wages, or a detailed letter to the Duke's man of business in London, complete with copies of his meticulously fraudulent bookkeeping. He was gone by nightfall. With Finch gone, a strange new energy began to stir in the house. Ilara took Mrs. Gable into her confidence, and the housekeeper, who had served the old Duke's family with a fierce, unwavering loyalty, transferred that loyalty to the young woman who was fighting so hard to live. Together, they became an army of two. They started with the house itself. They flung open windows, letting sunlight and fresh air wage war on the damp and the dust. They tore down the rotting curtains and scrubbed floors on their hands and knees. They polished silver until it gleamed with a fierce, defiant light. They hired 2 local girls to help, paying them a fair wage from the money she'd recovered from Finch's secret accounts. The great, shrouded ghosts in the drawing room were unveiled to reveal furniture of exquisite, if faded, beauty. Slowly, painstakingly, the house began to breathe again. Then Ilara turned her attention to the land. She walked the estate, her frailness giving way to a wiry strength. She spoke to the tenant farmers, not as a duchess, but as a partner. She listened to their struggles with blighted crops and leaking roofs. She studied the old maps, the soil reports, the history of the land. She discovered that the estate possessed vast tracts of ancient woodland, which Finch had been selling off for a pittance to a local timber merchant. She nullified the contract and negotiated a new one for 3 times the price, with a reputable firm from York. She used the income to repair the tenants' cottages and invest in new, hardier strains of wheat. The seasons turned. The first year of her quiet rebellion passed, then a second. Her cough faded, replaced by the clear, confident tone of a woman who gave orders and saw them followed. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, and a faint colour returned to her skin. The land, responding to her care, began to heal. The fields yielded a bumper crop. The gardens, long choked with weeds, were cleared and replanted, first with vegetables for the kitchen, then with flowers, defiant bursts of colour against the grey stone. Blackwood Manor was no longer a tomb, it was a living, thriving entity, and she was its heart. She had built a life from the ashes of the one she was supposed to have discarded. She had built a home. And then, 5 years after he had left her there to die, the Duke of Alistair returned. Julian came to Blackwood seeking an ending. The past 5 years in London had been a brutal, grinding war of political attrition. He had won victories that felt like defeats, and forged alliances that tasted of ash. He was weary down to his soul, tired of the noise, the ambition, the endless grasping hands. He came north, seeking the silence he remembered, the finality of a chapter he had closed long ago. He expected to find the dower house collapsed into a picturesque ruin, a fitting headstone for the pale, quiet girl he barely remembered. He needed to see the paperwork confirming her death, to officially close the account. It was a grim errand, but a necessary one. The first sign that something was amiss was the gate. It was new, solid oak, and hung properly on its hinges. It swung open smoothly at the touch of his coachman. He remembered a listing, rotting thing, held together with rust and ivy. As the carriage proceeded up the drive, he saw more anomalies. The gravel was raked and free of weeds. The great lawns, once a wilderness of tangled grass, were scythed and neat. The skeletal fingers of the ivy had been stripped from the house's stone face, revealing clean, strong lines. Smoke, a fragrant plume of applewood, curled from 3 separate chimneys. He stepped out of the carriage into a world he did not recognize. The air smelled not of decay, but of beeswax and damp earth and something baking. The front door, a deep, glossy black, was opened before he could knock by a maid in a crisp apron, who curtsied and looked at him with polite inquiry, not fear or resignation. "I am the Duke of Alistair," he said, the words feeling strange and hollow in his own mouth. "Her Grace is in the study, Your Grace," the girl replied, her composure absolute. "If you would follow me." Her Grace. The title struck him as absurd. He followed the maid through the hall. The leprous stains were gone. The air was warm. A vase of late-blooming roses stood on a polished table, their scent a quiet rebellion against the coming autumn. He was led to the door of the study, a room he remembered as a repository of mildewed books and broken furniture. The maid opened the door and stepped aside, and he saw her. She was standing by the window, not seated like an invalid, but standing tall, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. The room was transformed. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled and orderly. A fire crackled in the hearth. A large desk was covered not with clutter, but with neatly stacked ledgers and papers. She turned as he entered, and the breath caught in his throat. This was not the ghost he had come to lay to rest. The woman before him was a stranger. Her hair, which he remembered as a lank, lifeless brown, was a rich chestnut, coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. The translucent fragility was gone, replaced by a healthy, vibrant pallor. She was still slender, but it was the lean, economical slenderness of a whipcord, not the brittle thinness of illness. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the same cool grey colour he vaguely recalled, but now they were clear, direct, and unnervingly intelligent. They held no fear, no deference, and no welcome. He felt a profound, world-tilting disorientation, the ground shifting beneath his feet. All his certainties, all his careful plans, had just been rendered obsolete. "You're alive," he said. The words were blunt, stupid, the only ones his stunned mind could produce. Ilara looked at the man who was her husband. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulder. The 5 years had carved new lines into his face, around his eyes and mouth. He looked tired, worn down by a world she had blessedly escaped. He was a creature of power and politics, and he looked utterly out of place in the quiet, ordered world she had built. She felt a distant, academic curiosity, but no warmth, no flicker of connection. He was a complication, an intruder. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she replied, her voice perfectly even. "Would you care for some tea?" Her politeness was a blade. It established the new reality of the situation with brutal efficiency. She was the mistress of this house. He was the guest. An unexpected and perhaps unwelcome one. The clash was not loud or dramatic, but it was absolute. It was the sound of 2 worlds colliding in the quiet of a country study. He had come expecting a tomb, and had found a kingdom, and its queen had no intention of abdicating. Julian stayed. He had nowhere else to go, and a growing, unsettling curiosity that he could not dismiss. He was a man accustomed to command, to having his world order itself around his will. But here, in this house, his will was irrelevant. His authority was a foreign currency with no value. The household revolved around Ilara, a quiet, efficient solar system with her as its sun. The servants approached her for instructions, their respect genuine and deep. The tenants who came to the door spoke to her of rents and repairs, bypassing him as if he were a piece of furniture. He began to watch her. He saw her in the mornings, walking the grounds with a long, purposeful stride, her dog at her heels. He saw her in the study, her brow furrowed in concentration as she went over the accounts, her pen scratching softly in the quiet. The ledgers, which he had asked to see out of a bewildered need to understand, were a revelation. They were flawless, elegant in their precision. She had not merely saved the estate, She had transformed it into a profitable, thriving enterprise. She had tripled its income. His income. The realization was both humbling and deeply irritating. He tried to assert himself. He summoned the estate manager from his primary seat at Grandover, a man who had served his father for 30 years. The man, a Mr. Harding, arrived, reviewed Ilara's books, toured the fields, and spoke with the tenants. He returned to Julian that evening, his expression one of profound respect. "Your Grace," Harding said, "I have been managing estates my entire life. I have never seen work of this calibre. The Duchess has a genius for it. There is nothing for me to do here but offer my sincere admiration." Julian was superfluous. The feeling was novel and deeply uncomfortable. He was the Duke of Alastair, one of the most powerful men in England, and in his own house he was useless. He found himself wandering the grounds, a ghost in his own life. He took to chopping wood for the fireplaces, the clean, rhythmic impact of the axe, a satisfying release for his frustration. He helped a stable boy mend a broken fence. The physical labour was grounding, a way to impose some small, tangible order on a world that had slipped its moorings. The external world, however, would not be kept at bay for long. A letter arrived, bearing the imperious seal of his mother, the Dowager Duchess. She had heard of his retreat to the north, and, assuming he was in mourning for his conveniently deceased wife, was coming to offer comfort and, more importantly, to steer him back toward his duties, namely, securing a suitable and suitably fertile new bride. The Dowager's arrival was like a blast of Arctic air. She swept into Blackwood, her silks rustling, her lorgnette raised like a weapon, prepared to survey the charming decay and offer her condolences. What she found was a warm, well-run house and a living, breathing daughter-in-law who was not only healthy, but presiding over her domain with the quiet confidence of a monarch. The Dowager's shock curdled instantly into venomous disapproval. Ilara, with her ruined family and her history of illness, had been an unfortunate but temporary necessity. Ilara, the competent and self-possessed mistress of a profitable estate, was an intolerable affront. The campaign began subtly. A series of small cutting remarks about Ilara's plain dress. A pointed question about her family's misfortunes. A feigned surprise that she understood complex matters like accounts. Ilara met each jab with an unruffled, serene politeness that only infuriated the Dowager further. The conflict came to a head when the Dowager insisted on hosting a small dinner for the local gentry. It was a power play, an attempt to reassert her own status as the ranking female of the family and to expose Ilara as a provincial nobody. The dinner was a tense affair. The local squires and their wives were visibly in awe of the Dowager and nervously polite to Ilara. The Dowager held court, regaling the table with gossip from London, each story a subtle reminder of the world to which Ilara did not belong. Then, over the fish course, she made her move. "One must admire your resilience, my dear," she said, her voice carrying across the table, dripping with false sympathy. "To have been so very unwell. It is a miracle you recovered, though, of course, one worries about such constitutions. They are often delicate." not always suited to the rigours of producing an heir. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The guests stared at their plates. It was a brutal, public attack designed to humiliate Ilara and remind Julian of her fundamental failure as a duchess. Ilara paled slightly, but held her head high, her hands perfectly still in her lap. She was about to offer a cool, dismissive reply when Julian spoke. "My wife's constitution," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command, "has proven to be stronger than this house's foundations. She took a ruin and transformed it into the most profitable estate on my lands. She has faced illness, neglect, and isolation, and has not only survived, but triumphed." He paused, his cold gaze sweeping over the stunned faces at the table before landing on his mother. "Her strength is the single greatest asset this family possesses. We will not speak of it as a weakness again." He picked up his wineglass and raised it to Ilara. "To the Duchess," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the table. It was not a declaration of love, but it was a declaration of alliance. It was a choice. In that moment, he had, publicly, unequivocally, stood with her against his own mother. He had defended her, he had protected her, and as Ilara met his gaze, she felt the first crack in the ice that had encased her heart for 5 long years. The winter descended on Blackwood not long after the Dowager's strategic retreat, a campaign she had lost so decisively she could not bear to remain. The snow came first as a fine, persistent powder, then as a thick, smothering blanket, silencing the world and isolating the manor completely. The roads became impassable. For days, the only sound was the howl of the wind in the chimneys and the groan of ancient trees under the weight of the snow. It was in this enforced intimacy, this shared captivity, that the carefully constructed walls between Ilara and Julian began to crumble. One night, the storm rose to a fever pitch, a shrieking gale that rattled the window frames and seemed to claw at the very stones of the house. Ilara, unable to sleep, was reading by the fire in her sitting room when she heard a crash from the adjoining room, Julian's chamber. She hesitated for only a moment before taking a candle and going to his door. She knocked softly. There was no reply, only a low, guttural sound, a noise of pure animal distress. Pushing the door open, she found the room in disarray. A heavy armchair was overturned. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a landscape of deep, dancing shadows. Julian was standing in the centre of the room, rigid, his back to her. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. "Your Grace?" she said softly. "Julian?" He flinched at the sound of his name, turning slowly. In the flickering candlelight, his face was a mask of stark terror. His eyes were wide, unseeing, fixed on a horror only he could perceive. He was not in a bedroom in the north of England. He was somewhere else entirely. A place of noise and fire and death. She had read of it, the affliction that soldiers sometimes brought back from the war, a haunting of the soul that ambushes a man in the dead of night. Her first instinct was to retreat, to give him his privacy, but the stark, raw vulnerability in his face held her fast. This was not the cold, controlled Duke. This was a man drowning. She moved slowly, deliberately, into the room, setting her candle down on the mantelpiece. "You are at Blackwood," she said, her voice calm and even, an anchor in the storm of his terror. "You are home. There is a storm, but you are safe inside." She did not touch him, but moved to the fireplace, adding a log and stoking the embers back to life. The simple, domestic action was a counterpoint to the chaos in his mind. "Breathe," she commanded gently. "Listen to the wind. It is only wind." He shuddered, a violent tremor that ran through his entire body. His gaze slowly came back into focus, landing on her. He saw not a duchess, not a wife, but a point of stillness in a spinning world. "The noise," he rasped. "It sounds like the shelling." She said nothing, simply waited. She pulled the overturned chair upright and sat, a quiet, patient presence in the shadows. She did not offer platitudes or pity. She offered him her strength, her silence. They sat like that for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind, until the rigid terror slowly seeped out of him, leaving him slumped and exhausted in its wake. In the quiet aftermath, the words came. He spoke of the campaign in the peninsula, of a nighttime ambush, of the screams of men and horses, of the friend who had died in his arms. He spoke of it in a flat, toneless voice, laying out the facts of his haunting as if they were items in a ledger. He had never spoken of it to anyone. The confession was a raw, agonizing thing, the lancing of a wound that had festered in silence for years. When he finished, the room was steeped in a profound, sorrowful stillness. Ilara looked at this man, this stranger who was her husband, and saw the hidden architecture of his coldness, the trauma that had frozen him from the inside out. "My first winter here," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. The loneliness was a physical presence. I felt the cold in my bones, but the silence was worse. It was so complete, I thought if I screamed, no one would hear. I thought I had been buried alive. I used to lie awake and listen to the death watch beetles ticking in the walls, and I would count the seconds just to prove I was still here. It was her own confession of pain, a story of a different kind of war, a quieter, more solitary battle for survival. In that moment, in that firelit room, surrounded by the fury of the storm, they were no longer a duke and his inconvenient duchess. They were two survivors, each bearing the scars of their own private battlefield. They had exchanged not just stories, but vulnerabilities, creating a fragile, tentative bridge across the chasm that had separated them. A new, more intimate bond of trust had been forged in the heart of the winter storm. When spring finally broke the siege of winter, it brought with it a letter from London that was a declaration of war. The Dowager Duchess, having stewed in her humiliation, had not been idle. She had her lawyers unearth the original marriage contract, a document Julian had barely glanced at 5 years ago. It contained a clause, cleverly buried in legal jargon, inserted by his mother's solicitors. It stated that if the union remained without issue after a period of 5 years, the Duke had the right to petition for an annulment on grounds of non-consummation and constitutional frailty, whereupon all dower lands and properties would revert to the primary Alistair estate. It was a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of everything Alara had built. The 5 years were up. The marriage was unconsummated, and the dowager had called a formal family council in London, ostensibly to discuss ducal business, but in reality to spring this trap in the most public and humiliating way possible. Julian read the letter, his face turning to granite. "She means to destroy you," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "To erase you and take back this land." "Your land," Alara corrected him quietly, though the words were a knife in her own heart. Blackwood was hers. She had poured her life, her very soul, into its soil. "No," he said, his eyes meeting hers, and in them she saw a cold, righteous fury she had never seen before. "It is ours." They travelled to London together. They entered the dowager's imposing townhouse not as estranged spouses, but as a united front. The drawing-room was filled with the senior members of the Alistair clan, uncles, powerful cousins, all of them summoned to bear witness to Alara's downfall. The air was thick with smug expectation. The dowager sat like a spider at the centre of her web. She let them take their seats before she produced the contract with a theatrical flourish. "A sad necessity," she began, her voice oozing insincere regret. "But the continuation of the line must be our first priority. This document, Julian, provides a clean, legal solution to our dilemma." She slid it across the polished table toward him. Julian did not look at it. He looked at the faces around the room, faces of his family, who saw his wife not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, a barren field to be ploughed under. He saw their cold, pragmatic cruelty, and recognized it as a reflection of the man he himself had once been. He stood up. He walked to the table, picked up the contract, and without a word tore it in half, and then in quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. A collective gasp went through the room. The dowager's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "There will be no annulment," Julian said, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced all opposition. "You speak of assets," he said, his gaze sweeping over them. "So let us speak of them. 5 years ago, I abandoned my wife at a decaying property that was a drain on my resources. I left her in a state of ill health and neglect. That was my failing, my dishonour, and I will live with it for the rest of my days." He turned to look at Alara, his expression softening into something raw and vulnerable. "In those 5 years, this woman, alone and forgotten, took that ruin and transformed it. Through her intelligence, her resilience, and her sheer force of will, she has created one of the finest, most profitable estates in the north. She is the greatest asset this family has. She is my wife, the Duchess of Alistair, and you will show her the respect she has earned, and that I failed to give her." He walked to Alara's side and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "Blackwood belongs to her. And I," he said, his voice dropping, "meant for her but heard by all, belong to her. If any of you has a problem with that, you will find you have a problem with me. The council is over." Later that night, in the quiet of their London rooms, the formalities and the anger fell away, leaving only the two of them. He stood before her, stripped of his ducal armour, his pride, his certainty. "I was a hollow man, Elara," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "A title, a collection of duties. I lived in rooms, but I had no home. I was a ruin, as surely as Blackwood was. You took a pile of rot and stone, and you breathed life into it. You made it a home. You saved me from the ruin I was becoming." He reached out, his hands gently framing her face. "I do not ask for your forgiveness. I have not earned it. I ask for a chance to be a partner to you, to build a life with you, not as a duke and duchess, but as Julian and Elara." She looked into his eyes and saw the profound, irrevocable change in him. She saw the man who had faced down his family for her, the man who had shared his deepest trauma with her, the man who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. The ice around her heart did not just crack, it melted away, leaving a warm, aching tenderness in its place. "I am tired of being strong alone," she whispered, her own voice trembling slightly. It was her acceptance, not a surrender, but a choice, a conscious, deliberate step onto the bridge he had built, to meet him in the middle. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about gratitude and promise, and the profound, quiet relief of finally coming home. A year later, they were at Blackwood. The house was filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fires in its hearths. It was the warmth of life, of shared purpose, of quiet, contented love. The estate thrived under their joint management, a partnership of his political acumen and her practical genius. Laughter was now a frequent sound in the halls that had once echoed only with silence and sorrow. They were in the study, the room where he had first found her, a stranger in his own life. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. They were bent over the same ledger, their heads close together, discussing the planting schedule for the spring. It was a scene that mirrored his return, but the universe it contained was entirely different. He wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking at her. He watched the way a stray lock of hair fell across her brow as she concentrated, the way her brow furrowed slightly, the small, confident tap of her finger on a line item. He was no longer the distant lord, shocked by her competence. He was a husband, filled with a quiet, boundless adoration for his wife. And she was no longer the resilient survivor, walled off and alone. She was a woman cherished, a partner, at peace in the home she had not inherited, but forged from the raw materials of her own strength and spirit. She looked up, feeling his gaze, and a slow smile touched her lips. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said, reaching across the desk to take her hand. "Everything." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, familiar gesture that spoke of 1,000 shared moments, of a love that had not been a sudden spark, but a slow, steady flame, kindled in the coldest of winters, and now burning bright and clear. Outside, the gardens she had reclaimed from the wilderness were in full, glorious bloom. They had built their home, and now they were simply living in it.